Anyone here work with gas turbines? I've only seen a few hands, but I know a few people who are working with gas turbines who really, maybe we should do some hand exercises. Gas turbines produce a significant amount of CO2. As a matter of fact, combustion of fuel, and when we look at our carbon footprint, you'll realize that if we did an analysis, we'd find that there's an excessive amount of CO2 that are liberated from turbines. So Trinidad and Tobago can indeed make better use of its heavy oil resource with strategies that allow for sustainable development. There are sufficient heavy oil reserves, over 3 billion barrels, local expertise in enhanced oil recovery, and supplies of carbon dioxide, which can be used with other enhanced oil recovery methods to increase production. Our next presenter is a lecturer in the Petroleum Studies Unit of the Department of Chemical Engineering at UWI. She is a reservoir engineer specializing in enhanced oil recovery and carbon storage, and has recently presented her research at international and local conferences. I would like to present to you Dr. Lorraine Sobers.
Thank you and good afternoon. Today's presentation, you would hear me say heavy oil over and over again. You would hear me say CO2 over and over again. You would hear me say enhanced oil recovery. So those are the 3 bits, and we're going to put that all together and see how we can have sustainable development of our heavy oil deposits. I actually took the time and wrote a paper about this, and it was co-authored by Mr. Selwyn Lashley. He is the Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Energy and Energy Affairs. And a few years ago, he chaired the Carbon Emission Reduction Task Force, or the Carbon Reduction Task Force, when it was resident at the Ministry of Energy. I think now that responsibility has moved to another ministry. So basically, this is the outline. We're going to look at what's our issue, the past, the present, and the future. And the issue is really, I think you all heard about it before. In an earlier presentation, there was talk about climate change and global warming. And I'm going to look specifically in the first part of this presentation on its impact on small island developing states, also known as SIDS. And everybody is talking about this, from politicians to religious leaders, students, engineers, everybody. And I hope by the end of this presentation, you would see how, in some way, your work as an engineer, you would end up being involved in this overall initiative. Now, when we usually hear about climate change, we would see something about the poor polar bears who don't have anywhere to go, stranded, hungry, sad looking. Or we probably would have seen some sort of movie where they show Manhattan underwater. At least I suppose that's Manhattan, I don't know. Right? Or some first world country underwater. But for us, it comes a bit closer home. We are entering the rainy season, and we may see more of this. And one of the effects of changing rainfall patterns and the overall average increase in global temperature is that there is flooding. And here I have pictures from around Trinidad and Tobago. Actually, I don't think I have Tobago, just around Trinidad. We have, you see Mayaro there. You may be able to pick out some places in North Trinidad that never used to flood. And we even have along our highways, we have flooding. Another thing, we just came out of the dry season. One of the impacts if we have longer dry seasons is that we have more forest fires and all the resulting problems with topsoil loss and then flooding again. So there are a few other things that brings it straight home to us apart from polar bears and sinking cities. So small island developing states, no surprise, all of the CARICOM islands, all of the Caribbean islands classify as small island developing states. These are, among other things, small coastal countries. SIDS is actually a recognized negotiating group within the UN, and together they contribute less than 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Even though these countries don't contribute much to the problem, they are among those most vulnerable. And this map shows here the low coastal zones and CO2 emissions. So you put the two together, you see who is vulnerable and you see who is really culpable. And so we have the Caribbean there, and those islands across there, Micronesia, Samoa, and so on. The different colors represent what percentage of the population are living in low coastal areas. For most of the Caribbean islands, it's between 10 and 20%. We could discuss why it's not higher, but basically that's what it is. The darker the color, the greater the percentage of the population living in these areas that will be susceptible to rise in sea level and storm surges. Now, our response to climate change and the effects of it, we can do several things, and one of them, we can do nothing. And so this study was done by Bueno et al., and they looked at how much it would cost the Caribbean to deal with the impacts to storms, and how much it's going to cost them in terms of tourism and their infrastructure, of course, like the roads and so on that we just showed. So by 2025, they estimate that it would cost $10.7 billion US, and this is in 2007 dollars, representing 5% of the current GDP and that's for the whole region. If you pull out Trinidad and Tobago only, we have it would cost us 4% of our GDP to have to deal with these issues. Because of our geology, we're made up a little different from the other islands. It doesn't affect us the same, and of course we don't rely on tourism as much as they do. So this is the issue we have, and how did we get here? At least within the Trinidad and Tobago context, you would see that our gas and oil development increase. Our gas and oil development increase. We have the oil in green, right? You see oil production in green. On the y-axis, it's million barrels of oil equivalent per day, so we're able to put oil and gas on the same graph. And in red, we have the natural gas production, and those bits in red, black, that you can't see, that shows when different plants came on stream, whether it's Atlantic LNG, the methanol plants, urea plants, so on and so forth. It started off, I didn't realize you wouldn't be able to see this, it started off in 1953 with TNTech using natural gas. That's the second one there. And we end off with urea and melamine production and so on. So we see a dramatic rise in our natural gas production, and this is these are the plants that used it. And this is what happened with our CO2 emissions as these different plants came on stream. This is between 1990 and 2012. Yeah, you should be able to see it a bit closer here. So maybe some of you work in these places, TTMC, Titan Methanol, Atlas Methanol, so on and so forth. So as these came on stream, we had greater and greater annual carbon emissions, and generally Trinidad and Tobago is on an increasing trend. If we break that down a little bit further, now this is a very different pie chart from what you saw on the first day. For those of you who were here for the feature speaker, I believe he looked at what happens in the US, and they talk about, was it 40%? About 40% of their CO2 emission came from buildings, right? That's their heating and cooling. And for our emissions by sector, I am not seeing buildings anywhere there. The biggest contributor is the petrochemical sector. Second to that is power generation, with fossil fuel being burned and turbines and so on being used. And third and fourth, landfill and transport. So I broke those down. It's a pie chart, and I broke it down into the actual percentages and the numbers. So I'm not hiding everything from you. You have the percentages, and you have the actual volumes. So in total, Trinidad and Tobago emits 2.7 BCF of CO2 per day. I actually started off as a chemical engineer and ended off as a petroleum engineer. And right now I can't remember who uses what. But in petroleum, M means thousand. So MM is a million, and I just converted it into billions. So it's about 2.8 BCF of CO2 per day, and you would see how much actually comes from the petrochemical sector. When you line us up with the rest of the world on a per capita basis, which I agree is not a fair basis, you would see that Trinidad and Tobago ranks number 2. This is a bit dated. It's 2010 information, but that's the information we have from all the countries. So you would have later information from some countries and earlier from others. But it's for a level playing field. This is all 2010. We have Qatar and Trinidad and Tobago going neck and neck. We have about the same population, and then we have other culprits like Oman and Luxembourg. And I use that and I laugh because the population is so much smaller. You can't really compare us to the ones who are really emitting a lot of the CO2, such as China and US, and so mainly China and the US, mainly just those two. China actually accounts for a quarter of the CO2 emissions, and the US accounts for 15% of the world's emission. Trinidad and Tobago accounts for 0.15%. But here we are on the list of the top worst offenders on a per capita basis. Nevertheless, there are things that we can do as global citizens. And you may hear a lot of what we can do, and I want to put it up here so that you'll be well informed as engineers. You will hear of what we can do in the transportation sector, what we could do in terms of power generation and consumption, and finally in the petrochemical and the petroleum sector. I hope you can see this well. I'll give you some time to see what's really on this table. Okay, so we are, in Trinidad and Tobago, are considering switching to compressed natural gas. That would take 2.5 thousand tons, so the M is 1,000 tons of CO2 equivalent out of the system. And we would actually be making some money off of that, to the order of 325 million US. I have highlighted enhanced oil recovery, which is also a profitable initiative that we can undertake, and that should take about 7,000 tons of CO2 equivalent out of the system. You may hear a lot about switching from incandescent to compact fluorescent bulbs, and you'd see the impact that that has. Takes 1.3 out of the system. Power consumption efficiency, which your plants, if you're a process or a chemical engineer or wherever you work, this may apply to you. If you increase your power consumption efficiency, that sector could take 1.8 thousand tons of CO2 out of the system. And this is according to Al Tawil and Budlal. The NGA is the Natural Gas Institute of the Americas, which they worked with or ran out of UTT. You may also hear about wind energy and photovoltaic cells, and you see what that contributes. The contribution is relatively small, right? So I could say relatively because you see exactly how much it is. It's 0.8 and 0.7. These are their estimates. And it would actually cost us quite a bit, 25.6 million and 38.8 million respectively. So when you hear there are ways of reducing CO2 emissions, I have put some of the options for Trinidad and Tobago up here so that you have a better idea of how much it actually is going to impact and how much it's going to cost. So you have a relative idea. So these are the options for waste management. And we could look at carbon dioxide as a waste. Of course, we could prevent it from the early stages within design. We can reduce emissions by the way we integrate processes and even the selection of technology. Some of those countries that you see in the top 10 of emissions, they're actually going down because they're doing things like this. We can recover and recycle the CO2. And this is what I'm going to focus on. Recover CO2 from plants that are emitting at point leases and inject it into the ground. And of course, there's plain disposal, which is also known as CCS. You simply take carbon dioxide and you inject it into the ground. Now let us take a closer look at what that looks like. Let me see how much you can see here. Okay, number one, that's simply injecting carbon dioxide into depleted gas and oil reservoirs. So the reservoirs are already spent, but they are reservoirs. They can still hold gas and they could hold it well for many, many years. So that is one option. Another option, option 2, which is the one I will focus on, is injecting carbon dioxide into producing oil reservoirs. Now the thing is, carbon dioxide actually can dissolve in oil pretty well, much better than methane can, based on the composition, temperature, and pressure of the reservoir, the composition of the oil, the temperature and the pressure of the reservoir, you can have carbon dioxide dissolving in that oil and making the oil less viscous. So you move from having the properties of a peanut butter, right? So that's heavy oil, would be a bit difficult to move, to having it something more like a jelly, right? With carbon dioxide, if carbon dioxide is dissolved in it. If it's not completely dissolved, injecting the gas could still help some of the oil get out of the ground. And that's what we're going to focus on. What they did in Norway, that is Sleipner, they have a carbon tax levied on them, and their natural gas production, their natural gas had a high percentage of carbon dioxide, and the state said there's a tax on CO2. So instead of paying the tax, they decided to inject it into saline aquifer. Saline, so that's not drinking water or potable water, it's salt water. They inject it into a saline aquifer, and it's been a success story. Other countries could look at injecting into coal seams and coal bed methane recovery and so on. That's number 4, 5, and 6. So if we look closer at what I think we should focus on, we have CO2 coming, say, from the ammonia plants and other industries and probably gas-fired power plants, and that CO2 is then injected into the oil fields, quite simply. But this is not something that we could do alone, so what is happening is basically, in terms of carbon dioxide, upstream becomes downstream, and downstream becomes upstream. So instead of looking to have fossil fuel coming from the upstream sector and being transported to the downstream sector, we're taking carbon dioxide from the downstream and we're injecting it upstream. Right? I hope I haven't confused anybody there. So you start off with capture at the plant. It depends on the concentration of carbon dioxide that's being emitted. For the ammonia plants, we can get some relatively pure carbon dioxide, and that's great. Transport the carbon dioxide by pipelines and inject it into the ground. And these might look a bit familiar to you. So we actually have quite a bit of heavy oil, as was said earlier. Our current production, unfortunately, only accounts for 9% of our total oil production, our meaning Trinidad and Tobago. And when we say total oil production, we're including crude oil and we're including condensate, right? And it comes up to about 7,300 barrels of oil per day. That is from onshore and offshore. Primary recovery, that means that we're simply trying to get oil out of the ground. If we don't inject any carbon dioxide, any steam, these are the other methods we could consider: carbon dioxide, steam, LPG, that sort of thing, to get the oil out. That's characterized as enhanced oil recovery. But if we're not doing that, we're actually only recovering between 5 and 20% of the oil in place. That means that we're leaving 80 to 95% of the oil in the ground. If we use enhanced oil recovery methods such as carbon dioxide injection or steam injection or LPG, I'm saying LPG, but I really mean C2 to C5, you could get a bit more out of the ground. Now, what I'm proposing has been done before. Let me pause so that people would hear that. This has been done before in Trinidad and Tobago, but on a much smaller scale, and the purpose was different. So the way it was done was a bit different. Heavy oil reserves are important here and around the world. And this is what our production look like for crude oil and heavy oil in particular. Our production is falling. That is all that this says. Right? I just have a few minutes, so I would go a bit quickly. We have falling production for our conventional oil and our heavy oil. So with CO2 EOR, we have some technical EOR opportunities, is what I would call it. We have the ammonia plants that are producing high purity CO2. We have the CO2 at close proximity. Some countries have to consider laying pipelines over 300 kilometers long. For us, we're looking at between 30 and 50 kilometers. Everything is within short distance. That is the source and the sink. So the source is the downstream and the sink is now upstream. We have the opportunity to increase our oil production and also to reduce our emissions by sequestering some of the carbon dioxide downhole. Now, some of it will come up with the oil production, and that's my area of research, making sure that we can maximize how much CO2 can stay in the ground. And on the non-technical side, which you know ends up quite important on different stages, is that we could be a good global citizen of the world, a good global citizen. Some may say, well, we only have 0.15%. What use is it? What use is it for us to try anything? Let the U.S. and those others make the effort. But the thing is, by us demonstrating the integration between upstream, downstream, midstream, everybody coming together, we contribute towards that best practice. There's need for more of this so that other countries would know how to do it better. Of course, the country is committed to sustainable development. So the thing is, we and the rest of the world are going to produce our heavy oil anyways. And so this is one way that we could do it a bit more sustainably. There's a lot of talk of renewable energy, and that is good. Renewable energy has to go alongside conventional energy for quite a few years to come. And there are incentives. There are incentives for heavy oil production. There's an investment tax credit and capital allowances. On the other side, we have some challenges and we have some risk. The technical challenges is that it's a large-scale integrated project, so that means upstream, downstream, midstream. Chemical engineers have to talk to reservoir engineers and pipeline engineers, and then there's the safety, the mechanical engineers, everything, we all have to get together for this. So we have several companies that would need to work together. You could have some production of the CO2 from the reservoirs, and so they will be actually producing quite a bit of it, and that's what my research is about. There is some risk with the operating conditions. CO2, of course, is a bit different from natural gas, and so we have to consider the operating conditions for that would be a bit different as would be the safety risk. And there is a cooling effect with the decline of pressure if there's a leak, and so the pipelines and the way they're designed would have to be a bit different, and that's something for us to learn. On the non-technical side, there's the cost of right-of-way, the usual things with pipelines and so on, project management, transportation safety, public acceptance. We can't assume that or downplay that, and stakeholder engagement. Now, Trinidad and Tobago is already making strides in this. Here are some of the early stages of the CCS life cycle, that's carbon capture and storage. And I have taken this from the Global Institute of CCS, comparing us to some other countries. What this means is that we have some activity along the way. However, we have not yet identified a project. Different countries like the UAE and Mexico have gone about things a bit differently. So you would see they have participation in some of the facets, but not all. Right? So all this says is that there are different ways to go about it, and the steps don't have to go one after the other. There are quite a few benefits. I think I've touched on this again, but just to leave you with it, we can mitigate the climate change effects in our way. We can increase oil production. There is opportunities for jobs and new experts, and of course, new business. For us to achieve this, we need to have cooperation amongst all of us, and so I'm really pleased to be here with a professional society with a range of engineers. I'm not just talking to the usual people that I talk to, the upstream people. There's energy companies, financial institutions, civil society. Everybody will get into this because of the far-reaching effects. I thank you for your time, and I thank the Ministry of Energy and Petrotrin for their support. I'll now take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. Very, very interesting indeed. I now invite the floor.
You indicated that the petrochemical sector is like the largest producer of CO2. So I'm interested in what are some of the proposals in terms of getting that CO2 from the particular individual plants to the sites where they can, that CO2 can really be optimized. Mm-hmm. What sort of factored costs are we talking about? And also what sort of rate of returns, which is what some of the companies will be interested in. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's a great question. There's already a CO2 trunk line within the Point Lisas industrial estate. Some of the CO2 emitted from the ammonia plants are used for urea and methanol production. So there's that. And as I said, this was done before on a much smaller scale. So there was already the compression unit and so on set up at Point Lisas. And CO2 was piped using an old oil pipeline to Forest Reserve and to the Oropuch field. Last year, I believe, the Minister of Energy and Energy Affairs mandated NGC to look into the cost of building a pipeline from Point Lisas to the oil fields in the southern basin. As far as I know, that feasibility has not been completed, but it would be relative, in the range of, I don't know, I suppose how much it costs to build a pipeline along that distance, 30 to 50 kilometers. Of course, you have to think of the terrain, right of way, and all those things that I mentioned before. So I can't actually put a cost to it, but that is being looked into.
So Maurice, it sounds like some pre-stage work needs to be done. As you all would know, Maurice is, well, I know he's joining a new role, but there is a low pressure currently suffered in the country. And Maurice was one of the technical leads in seeing that low pipeline pressure operation from the offshore platform. Engineer Points?
Points Mackenzie, Appellate Council. I'm a civil engineer, so please excuse my lack of technical knowledge. For secondary recovery projects, if for instance, the tax incentive and the carbon tax credits are not sufficient, what additional incentives or financial mechanisms are required to make the project economics work at the state level, right? I mean, the political, economic, and social capital matrix. And also, a comment here, have you considered the use of secondary recovery using the byproduct from the Carousel plant? Because there is a few papers online where you can compare use of the salt that comes out. They have been using it for secondary recovery. So it's just a suggestion, so you can get a comparison.
Okay, I hope I remember everything you said. Let me be clear, the tax incentives are for enhanced oil recovery. They are not for carbon storage. We do not have any tax incentives for carbon storage. To make this work, it has to be profitable on the enhanced oil recovery side, right? Alone, right? To have it, to try and put the two together, because right now we're not on any carbon credit platform or anything like that, so we can't factor it in. However, from what I have seen and the research that I have done, I believe that with enhanced oil recovery only to get the heavy oil out, that could be profitable. On land, we do steam injection and some other things, but offshore, steam may not be a viable option. Not all reservoirs can use steam. So we will be comparing using steam or using CO2 or using something else, and what really decides that is the reservoir. The tax incentives, once again, is for the enhanced oil recovery. That deals with cost recovery, capital investment, depreciation of compression costs, and so on. That sort of thing is covered. So on the side of the policy of the state, there are some things being done for that, but not on the CCS side. And to answer your question, what is the effluent from the plant you spoke about? I'm not sure.
Salt water, basically.
Yes, we have a student actually looking at that. That's low salinity water flooding, right? So that you're right with secondary recovery, low salinity water flooding. We actually have a student who is looking at that at the master's level and hopefully going to do PhD research with that. So that is being considered at the University of the West Indies.
Mr. Nanku?
Dela Nanku, Atlantic. Just a couple of questions. What purity of CO2 would you looking at as ideal for injection? And in terms of companies that have mid-purity streams, 50% and below, would it be the responsibility of the company itself to design, install purification units? What type of economic benefits for the company itself would they be looking at in terms of rate of return? Because of the initial design, installation, conception, all of that would take a lot of money. And the companies that are willing to pay for the CO2, I mean, is it economically feasible in terms of getting that money back and within a short period of time?
Okay, thank you. That's a good question. Actually, the purer the better. right? If it's flue gas, that means it has CO2, nitrogen, and some other things. Those other things don't help with oil recovery directly, not as well as CO2 could. So if you simply take, for instance, flue gas and you inject it into the ground, it will increase the pressure, and so you get increased oil production. But if it's all CO2, the advantage of having the carbon dioxide is that it can dissolve in the oil and make the oil less viscous. So we go once again from that peanut butter to a jelly or to just plain old light-looking oil. On your question with the economics and so on, I really can't say that at this time. And what you're talking about is capture, right? So there will be some cost, you're right, for that, for you to, for a company to consider taking out those impurities so that it can be used downstream. And all of that will have to tie into the policies for carbon emission reduction. If the state does not put a tax on it, then companies may not want to do it. However, there are smaller operators, lease operators, who may be happy with what, say for instance, Atlantic will be putting out. There are companies who would have that tolerance, so to speak. And there are also companies that are right now using nitrogen. So what companies would want to use could vary across the board, but I can't say exactly with the economics because there's no policy, there's no tax, there's nothing like that to run carbon emission reduction economics on to see if it's worth it for a company to refit their effluents.
Last question.
Ian, could you enlighten us as to whether there's any research into the use of carbon dioxide in industrial processes as a feedstock for any other downstream products?
Yes, that's an excellent question. Thank you. There's actually some plants, I think there are 4 worldwide, where they're using carbon dioxide to create plastics, PPE. Saudi Arabia just put down a really big plant. I can't tell you the size of it, but they're using the Asahi Kansi process. I may have said that really wrong, but it's a Japanese firm, and they're using carbon dioxide to include in the plastics polymer, right? So that's one of the bigger ones. At this stage, it's not competitive with the other plastics, but I think with scale, the scale at least that Saudi Arabia decided to go for, and an improved technology, it could become competitive. But right now, that's the one that I could think of. Also, in concrete, you could use CO2 in concrete. I believe you spoke about that before, to get harder concrete. And then there's using CO2 to grow algae, which could then be used to extract oil, and that can go directly to the refinery. However, I can't quantify how much CO2 these processes are taking out of the system, right? But quite a few are promising. At the University of West Indies, we have somebody looking at using algae as a source of oil that can go straight to the refinery. And that can be on wastewater, seawater, fresh water, it doesn't matter. So it's not competing with food crops.
Very good. I think the point you wanted to raise there was that CO2 can be used for a number of downstream processes. Another good aspect is recovering waste heat from CO2 as well. As you know, flue gas is usually hot. Very interesting topic, very well talked about, not only in Trinidad but globally. As a matter of fact, there is an EOR site that sends monthly magazines. So let's hear it for Dr. Lorraine Sobers.